The Cats on Ben Yehuda Street by Ann Reddish Stampler and illustrated by Francesca Carabelli. Up and down Ben Yehuda Street, cats, cats, cats. Cats curling up on benches and stretching underneath. Cats licking their paws on porches and climbing in leafy branches. Free cats, fat cats, living on the sidewalk cats. Cats with no collars, for collars show that cats belong to somebody, and street cats belong to no one but themselves. Messy, meowing, useless cats, muttered Mr. Modiano as he unlocked the Tel Aviv Fish Palace each morning. All day long he shooed cats from his doorway. But every night, when Mr. Modiano climbed the stairs to his apartment, two cats dozed on a cushion by Mrs. Spiegel's door. Your cats bring more cats, he pointed at Ketsi, Mrs. Spiegel's little gray cat with a pink collar, lying on a pillow next to Gatito, a fluffy white cat with no collar at all. Then Mr. Modiano would give Mrs. Spiegel whatever fish he had left over, arranged on a platter just so. This fish is fit for a queen, not for cats, he warned. Thank you, Mrs. Spiegel said, and would you maybe like to come in for a little tea? But Mr. Modiano always said, no, lo, lo, lo. As soon as Mr. Modiano closed his door, Mrs. Spiegel put the fish into a bowl for the two cats to share. But the apartment building rules said just one cat, so after dinner, only Ketsi could come inside. Mrs. Spiegel liked the way Ketsi helped her knit and the way Ketsi kept her company in the kitchen. She liked it when Ketsi licked her face to wake her up in the morning. And she liked the way Ketsi was always there. One night, Mr. Modiano brought salmon. This is for you, not for your cat, he said, just barely stroking Gatito's back. Thank you, Mrs. Spiegel said. Would you like to maybe come in for a little tea? Mr. Modiano always said, lo, 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 no, no, no. The next night, Mr. Modiano brought a plate of pickled herring. I almost tripped on this wild animal, he muttered, just barely tickling Gatito's fat tail. A nice cat like this would keep you company, Mrs. Spiegel told him. Company, Mr. Modiano frowned. What does an old man need with messy, meowing company? Well, would you like to maybe come in for a little tea? She asked. And Mr. Modiano always said, no, lo, lo, lo. Every morning, Mrs. Spiegel walked to the beach with Ketsi to breathe in the salty smell of the Mediterranean Sea. As soon as they neared the waves, Ketsi ran home. She didn't like to be so close to the water. When Ketsi got home from the beach, she and Gatito waited on the porch for Mrs. Spiegel to return. Until one day, when Ketsi wasn't there. Where is Ketsi? Asked Mrs. Spiegel. Gatito's nose was poking through the railing as if he were looking for Ketsi too. Mrs. Spiegel clumped downstairs. She searched up and down Ben Yehuda Street, between the buildings and under the tables at the sidewalk cafe. She asked everyone she met, have you seen my Ketsi? Everybody had seen plum cats and skinny cats, spotted cats and striped cats, but no little gray cat with a pink collar. Everybody pointed to wrong-sized, wrong-colored, and wrong-faced cats. Mrs. Spiegel dragged her sad self home. Mr. Modiano was leaning out of the door of the fish palace, shooing away cats. What's wrong, silly Gatito, he said. He isn't silly, Mrs. Spiegel said. Ketsi is gone. Cat, said Mr. Modiano. Maybe she ran away. Mrs. Spiegel burst into tears and clumped up to her apartment. She tried to eat, but she wasn't hungry. She tried to knit, but without Ketsi in her lap, she couldn't. When Mr. Modiano came by, she did not invite him in for tea. I know you have a low opinion of cats, she said, but my Ketsi would never run away. If not for something terrible happening, my Ketsi would come back. Mr. Modiano left quietly. Then a most unusual thing happened. Mrs. Spiegel heard the noisy putt-putting of a motor scooter in the alley. There sat Mr. Modiano, perched on the back of his scooter. Don't worry, he called up to Mrs. Spiegel. Humph, Mrs. Spiegel muttered, as if she would worry about a cat-hating man like Mr. Modiano. Mrs. Spiegel paced up and down in her apartment. She thought about going to bed, but the idea of waking up without Ketsi there to lick her face made her cry. Then, long after midnight, she heard putt-putting in the alley. Outside on the porch, Gatito meowed, and then there was more meowing. Mrs. Spiegel ran down the stairs. Mr. Modiano held a little gray cat with a pink collar, her front legs sticking straight out in a stiff white cast. My Ketsi! Mrs. Spiegel cried, burying her face in the soft gray fur. Cat, said Mr. Modiano, gently cradling Ketsi as Gatito rubbed against his leg. I found her at the animal hospital. She must have had a tussle with a car, silly cat, but she's going to be fine. The next morning, Mrs. Spiegel put Ketsi in a basket to walk to the sea. We'll just close enough to smell the salt, she said. But when they got back, Gatito was not in the landing. Not only that, the cushion was gone too. Just then, Mr. Modiano opened his doors. Sitting neatly on the cushion in the middle of the living room, just so, was a fluffy white cat with a new blue collar. Gatito. Do you see his blue collar? Don't look so surprised, said Mr. Modiano. You think I want to hunt all night for this one too? Mrs. Spiegel smiled. Mr. Modiano, she said, would you like to maybe come in for a little tea? Mr. Modiano said, la, la, la. And then he opened his door even wider, and he smiled too. But maybe I could make a cup of tea for you, he said, and a saucer of milk for your cat. That is the end of this wonderful book. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. It's certainly one of my favorites. Take care. Bye-bye.